the most sensual practices in Viking times. If you were to step into a Viking household in the 9th century, the first thing that would strike you would not be the weapons, nor the carved dragon heads that later poets loved to describe, but the smell. Imagine a heavy scent of wood smoke mixed with salted fish, the faint sour tang of fermented milk, and the thick animal warmth of furs. Longhouses were not built for elegance. They were practical, communal, and meant to endure the long winters of Scandinavia. Yet, hidden within this smoky architecture of daily survival was also the setting for courtship, intimacy, and marital life. Though larger farmsteads could stretch even farther, it had thick timber walls, a roof of turf or thatch, and no chimney. Smoke drifted upward and seeped through small holes in the roof, so that inside the air was always hazy, lit with shafts of pale sun or the flicker of oil lamps. The central hearth dominated the room. This was not just where meals were cooked, but where stories were told, marriages arranged, and bonds between families solidified. In a society that valued kinship and reputation above most else, the hearth became the stage for both the mundane and the sensual. Now, you may imagine intimacy in the modern sense, behind closed doors, with privacy, softness, and quiet. But for the Vikings, privacy was nearly non-existent. In the longhouse, several generations lived together, grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes enslaved laborers. Animals could even be brought into adjoining spaces during harsh winters. To sleep was to share space, and to court or even consummate a marriage meant negotiating with the thin walls of sound, the ever-watchful eyes of kin, and the unwritten codes of modesty. Beds themselves were often simple wooden frames filled with straw and covered in furs. Some households had built-in wall beds boxed in with wood, giving at least the illusion of separation. Others were just benches along the walls, where bedding could be spread at night and folded away in the morning. It was here that couples, whether newlyweds or long married, would carve out their private moments in a very public setting. Archaeologists have found traces of bed frames carved with runes, some invoking fertility or love, suggesting that even these mundane sleeping spaces carried symbolic weight. Drinking also played a role in loosening the boundaries of intimacy. Mead-fermented honey diluted with water was at once nourishment and social glue. Feasts would see horns of mead passed around, toasts exchanged, and alliances strengthened. In sagas, it is often during such gatherings that couples met, flirted, and, in some cases, arranged future unions. The mead hall, with its smoky rafters and rhythmic clinking of cups, became a site of both public bonding and private negotiation. To raise a horn of mead together could be a pledge, and to drink from the same vessel was almost as binding as the legal contracts that followed. Unlike later medieval societies, where noble women were cloistered, Viking women were highly visible in daily labor. They managed households, oversaw farming when men went raiding, and held authority in matters of inheritance. To notice someone romantically was often to notice them in the rhythm of daily chores: churning butter, tending sheep, repairing nets, or weaving cloth. These tasks, dull to our modern ear, became the backdrop for a society where survival was collective and visible. Intimacy, then, was never purely physical. It was tied to admiration of skill, endurance, and competence. There is a curious practicality in how Viking families arranged marriages. Unlike the romanticized sagas of love at first sight, unions were often settled through negotiation. Fathers and brothers held authority in deciding matches, and dowries in the form of land, livestock, or valuable textiles were carefully measured. Yet, within this pragmatic framework, there was room for play. Courtship songs, riddles, and jokes peppered feasts. A man might carve a rune into wood, not overtly declaring love, but hinting at it through layered symbols. A woman might gift a piece of cloth, her weaving carrying hours of labor, and thereby a quiet promise. The eroticism of Viking life, therefore, was not in secret trysts or hidden gardens, but in these small gestures, a glance across the hearth, a shared cup. And yet, we cannot ignore that alongside partnership, there existed practices that today would feel strange or even unsettling. For instance, sagas occasionally mention love magic, charms designed to attract or repel affection. One story tells of a woman who carved runes into a whalebone, slipped it under a man's bed, and thereby caused him sleepless nights filled with desire. Another saga describes a man accused of using a form of sorcery often associated with women to seduce. In both cases, the boundary between intimacy and control blurred, reminding us that attraction was as much a matter of reputation as it was of passion. Within the longhouse, these stories resonated. Imagine lying down at night, the fire reduced to embers, the air thick with smoke. Around you, family members are settling into furs, the shuffle of feet, the quiet coughs, the sound of animals stirring. In that liminal space, the smallest movement, hand reaching across a blanket, the rustle of straw became amplified. The erotic was not in the grand gestures, but in the small ones, carried out within earshot of the entire household, yet pretending at secrecy. It is also telling that in Viking poetry, metaphors for intimacy often revolved around agriculture or ships. A man might be described as plowing or as steering into a harbor. These metaphors may feel blunt to us, but they reflected a culture where the rhythms of farming and seafaring structured life. To speak of love was to speak in the same language as sowing crops, guiding vessels, or sharing food. And so the longhouse, with its mingled smells of fish, earth, and smoke, became a theater where these metaphors came alive. The hearth itself deserves closer attention. More than a cooking space, it was sacred. Fire was both warmth and life, and its maintenance often fell to women. Some anthropologists suggest that the care of the hearth symbolized control over the rhythms of family life, including reproduction. In this sense, the hearth was an erotic symbol too. It glowed, it consumed fuel, it required attention, and it sustained the household. Lovers might sit near it, talk near it, or be married before it. Its smoke carried not only the smell of meals, but the memory of unions and promises. Still, the question lingers: how did people experience desire in such crowded conditions? Did they simply accept the presence of others, or find small ways to shield themselves? Archaeological reconstructions suggest that wealthier families built partitions, wooden walls, or woven curtains that divided the longhouse into sections. These spaces, while hardly soundproof, at least gave the illusion of privacy. In poorer homes, however, the compromise was silence, discretion, or perhaps a resigned indifference from family members who pretended not to hear. What makes this history both fascinating and soothing is that it strips intimacy of its modern expectations. There were no locked doors, no silk sheets, no scented oils. There was smoke, straw, wool, and the quiet endurance of long winters. To find desire here was to make do with what was available: a carved rune, a horn of mead, a bed frame etched with symbols, the shared warmth of furs. And perhaps, as you imagine yourself drifting into that smoky longhouse, you begin to wonder, what did it really feel like to live in such closeness, where every sigh and whisper was part of the communal rhythm? Was intimacy deeper because it was harder to find, or was it muted by the constant press of family life? That is a question we will carry with us into the next part, where we turn from the architecture of intimacy to the rituals of courtships, strange, practical, and sometimes amusing, where goats, dowries, and mead all had their place. The Viking world was filled with symbols that blurred the line between daily labor and the mysteries of attraction. Where some cultures divided the sacred from the mundane, the Norse often mingled them, weaving magic into ordinary gestures. To speak of love in Viking times meant to speak also of fertility, runes, and the uncanny belief that unseen forces shaped human bonds. It was not enough to work, feast, and marry. There was always the possibility that charms, whispered spells, or ritual offerings stood behind the course of a relationship. Much of this strangeness emerges from the sagas, where references to love magic appear again and again. In one tale, a woman carves runes onto a piece of whalebone and places it beneath the bed of a man she desires. He becomes restless, tormented by dreams and longing, unable to focus on his work. In another, a man is accused of practicing seer, a form of sorcery most often associated with women. To accuse a man of seer was to cast suspicion not only on his honor but on his masculinity. Even so, the temptation of magic was strong. For the idea that desire could be stirred or stifled by human hands was too alluring to ignore. These runes were not idle doodles. The Vikings believed that symbols carved into wood, bone, or stone carried power, particularly when combined with spoken incantations. A rune could bless a ship for safe passage, but it could also nudge the heart of another person. Whether this was superstition or simply a form of symbolic courtship, it reveals how strongly people believed that intimacy was never only about two bodies. It was about unseen energies moving between them, sometimes called down through ritual. Fertility was, unsurprisingly, a central concern. In a land where winters were long and resources limited, the survival of families depended on children. Thus, fertility rituals often carried erotic undertones, though cloaked in symbolism. Sacrifices to the gods were made not only for good harvests, but for healthy marriages and strong heirs. At certain festivals, offerings of food and drink were poured onto the earth, an act both practical and suggestive, linking the fertility of the soil with the fertility of human unions. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, often entered into these rituals. Small hammer-shaped amulets have been uncovered across Scandinavia, worn by both men and women. Some scholars believe they served not only as religious tokens, but as talismans of fertility and marriage. In ceremonies, a hammer might be placed in the lap of a bride, blessing her womb. The gesture, solemn on one level, was also strikingly physical, grounding the union in both myth and body. Charms extended into everyday life as well. Herbs were valued not only for healing, but for their supposed power to influence attraction. Dill, parsley, and lovage were believed to kindle desire. Women preparing meals might slip such herbs into food, turning supper into a quiet invocation. A pouch of dried plants, worn near the skin, might be carried as a personal amulet. These small practices blurred the distinction between medicine, cooking, and love magic. The sagas hint, too, at the dangers of misuse. A carved rune that went wrong could sicken rather than seduce. One story tells of a woman who tried to win a man's love with runes, but carved them incorrectly, leading him to fall ill until the spell was corrected by a more skilled practitioner. Such tales remind us that the erotic in Viking times was never free of risk. To seek desire through magic was to step onto unstable ground, where affection could tip into illness, obsession, or disgrace. For men, accusations of enchantment carried particular weight. Viking society prized strength, honor, and self-control. To be suspected of manipulating desire through sorcery could be seen as weak, even unmanly. Women, however, were permitted a greater association with magic, though not without consequence. A woman too deeply tied to sorcery risked suspicion of witchcraft, which could stain her family's reputation. Yet the persistence of stories about women weaving runes, mixing herbs, and whispering incantations suggests that many were willing to take the risk. Erotic charms were not confined to private unions. They could influence politics, too. Marriages among chieftains were delicate negotiations, and whispers of love magic sometimes explained unexpected outcomes. If a powerful man suddenly favored a less advantageous match, rivals might mutter that he had been ensnared by runes or spells. In this way, intimacy and politics intertwined, with magic serving as a convenient explanation for choices that defied logic. At the same time, the Vikings found humor in these themes. Bodhi verses often joked about charms gone wrong or exaggerated claims of fertility. A man might boast that a single rune could bring every woman in a village to his bed. Others would laugh, recognizing the absurdity. Such humor both acknowledged and deflated the anxiety surrounding magic. It was a way of talking about desire in public, cloaked in laughter. One cannot overlook the role of dreams in this culture. The Norse took dreams seriously, often interpreting them as omens. Erotic dreams were no exception. A dream of coupling could be read as a sign of fertility, a promise of marriage, or even a warning of scandal. Families discussed dreams around the hearth, seeking meaning in their symbols. To dream of intimacy was not dismissed as idle fancy, but folded into the larger web of social interpretation. What emerges from all this is a picture of intimacy that was never private in the modern sense. It was always shared through ritual, family, or rumor. Magic, charms, and omens provided a language to speak about desire indirectly. In a society where open declarations could be risky, symbols and superstitions filled the gap. A carved rune, a sprig of herb, a dream retold at the hearth. Each became a vessel for feelings too potent to name aloud. And yet, one cannot help but wonder how these practices shaped the lived experience of couples. Did charms truly sway affection? Or did people simply believe more strongly because they wanted to? Was a marriage blessed with herbs and runes more harmonious? Or did the rituals serve mainly to soothe anxieties? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. That belief itself created the effect, lending confidence to lovers and dignity to unions. The smoky air of the longhouse, the rhythm of work, the clink of mead horns, the whispers of magic together, they formed the fabric of Viking intimacy. Practical, symbolic, and sometimes bizarre, These practices remind us that desire has always been entangled with culture. And as you drift deeper into this world, you may find yourself asking, when rituals, spells, and runes held so much sway, what room remained for the private spark of passion, unmediated and unplanned? The Viking longhouse was more than a dwelling. It was the center of daily life, a space for family, labor, meals, storytelling, and rest. Its smoky rafters, packed earth floors, and constant murmur of voices created an atmosphere both communal and confining. To imagine intimacy within such walls is to picture not private chambers but shared spaces where generations lived side by side. Privacy, as we think of it today, was rare. Desire had to adapt to this reality, finding its place within the rhythms of collective life. The typical longhouse was a single, elongated structure, its walls built from timber or turf, sometimes both. Along the sides, benches doubled as beds, covered with animal skins or woven blankets. The central hearth provided warmth and light, though it also filled the air with smoke that clung to hair, clothing, and skin. Families, servants, and sometimes livestock occupied these spaces together, their daily lives intertwined. It was a world where secrecy was difficult and overhearing was inevitable. Couples seeking closeness did so in a landscape where the line between public and private was thin. Children slept only a few feet away. Servants passed through with tasks at odd hours. Visitors, traveling merchants, or distant relatives might settle for the night in the same hall. In such a setting, intimacy became a matter of timing, discretion, and endurance. It required the art of slipping moments into the margins of a crowded life. For some, the lack of privacy was taken for granted, woven into the fabric of expectation. A marriage was not only a union between individuals, but between families, and with that came a collective gaze. In-laws, siblings, and elders often shared the same roof, aware of one another's habits. The continuation of the family line was everyone's concern, and so the most personal acts carried communal significance. When a couple produced children, it was celebrated not only as personal joy, but as a strengthening of kinship bonds. This environment created both pressure and support. A husband and wife might feel the weight of eyes upon them, the unspoken expectation that intimacy must yield offspring. Yet they were also surrounded by networks of help. Midwives, wise women, relatives who shared childcare, elders who offered advice. The longhouse was both suffocating and sustaining. It constrained personal freedom, but wove individuals into a resilient community. Archaeological findings suggest that wealthier families sometimes carved out semi-private chambers within longhouses, partitioned by wooden walls or curtains. These offered a degree of seclusion, though sound and presence still traveled easily through the building. For most, however, such luxuries were rare. A simple woolen curtain might be drawn, signaling the need for privacy. The gesture was understood, but not always respected. It was a polite fiction, a way of acknowledging desire without truly concealing it. The sagas occasionally mention the embarrassment of such closeness. Jests were made at the expense of couples caught in compromising situations, their attempts at secrecy foiled by the thin boundaries of shared space. These tales often carry a humorous tone, suggesting that the community tolerated such incidents with good-natured amusement. After all, intimacy was not an unusual occurrence. It was a predictable part of life, even if it sometimes unfolded in less than ideal circumstances. In this way, Viking intimacy carried a paradoxical blend of exposure and acceptance. On the one hand, the absence of privacy meant that couples rarely enjoyed solitude. On the other, this very openness normalized desire as part of the human experience. There was little room for prudish denial. Children grew up in close proximity to adults, observing the rhythms of life, learning by osmosis the ways of family and union. What modern eyes might consider shocking was, for them, simply the texture of existence. The practicalities of life in the longhouse also shaped intimacy. Bedding was often made of straw or hay, changed periodically, but not daily. The skins of animals, used as covers, carried their own odors. Smoke from the hearth permeated clothing and bedding alike. In winter, when the cold pressed hard against the walls, people slept close together for warmth, layering bodies as well as blankets. Under these conditions, intimacy was not a pristine or scented affair. It was rugged, earthy, and deeply entwined with survival. Even the presence of animals influenced this atmosphere. In some households, livestock were sheltered indoors during harsh weather, their heat adding to the warmth of the longhouse. The lowing of cattle or the shifting of sheep became part of the soundscape of family life. Couples who sought closeness did so amidst these noises, finding tenderness in a world where human and animal lives overlapped. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, affection in Viking households took on a practical tenderness. Small gestures, sharing a cloak on a cold night, offering the best portion of food, carving a simple trinket spoke volumes. Love was not displayed with grand declarations, but with actions woven into the daily grind. A husband might mend his wife's tools. A wife might add herbs to a drink to ease her husband's fatigue. These acts of care carried the weight of intimacy, binding couples together in ways that transcended the lack of privacy. The longhouse also became a stage for the larger rituals of marriage. Wedding feasts were often held within these halls, with guests gathered to witness the union. Songs were sung, toasts made, and gifts exchanged. The public nature of such ceremonies reflected the broader truth. Intimacy was never purely personal. It was always connected to kinship, inheritance, and the continuity of community. What followed the feast, the joining of the couple in bed, was understood by all to be the seal upon the agreement. The hall where family and neighbors celebrated was often the same hall where the couple began their shared life. Dreams of greater seclusion must have existed. Couples who could afford private dwellings, or who traveled to remote farmsteads, likely enjoyed a freedom unknown to others. But for the majority, the longhouse was both shelter and constraint. It forced intimacy to adapt, to thrive within noise and closeness, to transform privacy into something more symbolic than physical. One might wonder how such conditions affected desire itself. Did couples grow accustomed to the constant presence of others, their intimacy becoming matter-of-fact? Or did secrecy, however imperfect, add a layer of intensity, making each moment of closeness more precious? Perhaps both were true. What is certain is that intimacy in Viking times was not defined by solitude, but by endurance, adaptability, and the ability to find connection within constraint. Even so, the imagination offered escape. Stories, songs, and sagas painted pictures of love and desire, sometimes idealized, sometimes tragic. Listeners could dream of encounters unburdened by crowded halls or noisy hearths. These narratives provided a mental space where longing could breathe more freely. They did not erase the reality of the longhouse, but offered a counterbalance, a reminder that intimacy could also be poetic, noble, or transcendent. In the end, the Viking longhouse stands as a symbol of how culture shapes desire. It reminds us that intimacy is never purely biological, but is framed by the architecture, customs, and rhythms of life around it. For the Norse, closeness was communal, noisy, imperfect, and yet deeply human. It was carried out not in isolation, but within the heartbeat of the household, woven into the same walls that sheltered kin, animals, and fire. And perhaps, in that mingling of lives, intimacy found a form as enduring as the longhouses themselves, which stood for generations against the wind and snow. As Viking society developed through centuries of trade, raiding, and settlement, the expression of erotic practices began to show the influence of outside cultures. Contact with the British Isles, with Frankish lands, and especially with the East through rivers leading to Constantinople, introduced new ideas about intimacy, marriage, and pleasure. These exchanges were not necessarily dramatic or sudden, but seeped into daily life, reshaping habits and expectations slowly, like the way water shapes stone. Consider, for instance, the influence of trade. Viking merchants did not only carry timber, amber, or furs. They also brought back fabrics, perfumes, and ornamented objects that could be woven into the experience of desire. A Frankish silk garment might become a gift that carried meaning far beyond its practical use, draped across a lover's shoulders or spread on a bed as a sign of status and tenderness. The introduction of finer combs and oils, meanwhile, emphasized grooming and appearance, subtle but significant in courtship rituals. What began as luxury for the wealthy slowly filtered into broader society, altering the ways Vikings presented themselves to one another. The presence of slaves in Viking householdsmen and women, captured during raids, add another layer to the erotic life of the era. While it was not spoken of in glowing terms, it was a reality that shaped intimacy. Servitude blurred lines between consent and obligation, introducing relationships that were unequal yet embedded within the household structure. A chieftain's concubine, taken from a distant land, might bear children who carried both foreign and Norse blood, folding new lineages into the family tree. This practice complicated the community's sense of belonging and desire, making erotic life not just personal but also political and economic. Religion, too, underwent transformation. As Christianity spread into Scandinavia, it collided with the older Norse myths, bringing with it new ideas about morality and restraint. The transition was uneven, with some regions holding firmly to the stories of Freya and fertility, while others accepted the Christian insistence on chastity outside marriage. This tension was reflected in intimate life, where once erotic expression had been openly tied to fertility and prosperity. It was now shaded by notions of sin and confession. Yet, for many, the older habits did not disappear quickly. Rituals tied to the land, to seasonal festivals, and to communal gatherings carried echoes of their earlier meaning. Even as new religious structures took root, even the sagas composed centuries later provide glimpses of how erotic practices were remembered. They describe not only marriages and betrayals, but also the sly humor and playful exchanges that accompanied intimacy. A saga might recount how a woman refused a man until he proved his bravery, or how a man boasted about conquests that were more figurative than literal. These tales remind us that erotic life was not only about acts, but also about stories told, reputations shaped, and laughter shared across the hall. Domestic practices reveal much as well. Bedding was simple, but attention to comfort grew as trade expanded. The use of furs, feather-stuffed pillows, and imported fabrics made shared sleeping spaces warmer and more inviting. Bathhouses, too, offered settings that blurred the line between cleanliness and sensuality. Bathing together, surrounded by steam and the fragrance of herbs, allowed for encounters that were at once ordinary and intimate. This was not considered scandalous, but rather part of maintaining health and bonds within the community. The erotic in Viking times was thus never a singular or isolated experience. It was shaped by outside contact, by religion influx, by economic shifts, and by the deep connection between people and the land they lived upon. It was expressed in objects, in rituals, in everyday habits, and in the way stories were told and retold. Even as cultural pressures began to redefine what was acceptable, the practical, earthy understanding of desire persisted. And yet, as Viking society edged closer to its Christianized future, one wonders how much of their older, freer expressions of intimacy survived quietly in private moments, away from the eyes of priests and rulers. By the time Viking society began to transition fully into the Christian world, the echoes of its earlier erotic practices had already been reshaped, softened, and in some cases erased from open memory. Yet memory does not vanish so easily. It lingers in stories, in gestures, in the way people treat one another, even after official laws and religious teachings demand new ways of living. To conclude this story, it helps to imagine the quiet spaces where the intimate life of the Vikings carried on, often unchanged beneath the surface of outward conformity. In many households, the rhythm of life still revolved around the seasons. Winter nights remained long, and within the warmth of the longhouse, men and women still found ways to share their closeness. Even as priests preached restraint, couples exchanged gifts, whispered promises, and practiced the rituals of fertility in ways that tied their lives to the soil and livestock. The connection between erotic union and prosperities, so central in the old religion, did not disappear overnight. It continued in the unspoken assumption that intimacy was not merely personal pleasure, but part of ensuring that families, fields, and communities flourished. Fertility festivals changed in name, but often not entirely in practice. What had once been offerings to Freya or to the Vanir became rebranded under Christian saints. Yet, the sense of collective joy and the undercurrent of sensual energy remained. Young people still gathered, still danced, still courted in ways that blurred the boundary between religious celebration and personal encounter. The formal church might disapprove, but ordinary people carried forward traditions in ways that suited their own lives. What is striking about the Viking world is its tolerance for humor and directness in matters of desire. Sagas and poems reveal how men and women alike teased one another with verses that were sharp, playful, and occasionally biting. This openness suggests a cultural resilience, even as external powers pushed for restraint. People continued to speak of desire in ways that acknowledged its place in everyday life. It was not hidden in shame, but neither was it idealized, was part of the human condition. To be managed with wit, practicality, and sometimes blunt honesty. Objects tell part of the story as well. Archaeological finds of amulets, carvings, and charms tied to fertility indicate that symbols of erotic power were carried even into the Christian period. A pendant shaped like a hammer, a stylized figure of male virility, or a small carving of a woman's form. These items suggest that people still valued and perhaps sought the protective strength of sexuality in their lives. Such artifacts, while simple, point to an undercurrent of belief that desire was not only natural but protective, something that safeguarded family and community. Slavery, though uncomfortable to modern eyes, remained part of the fabric of erotic life. The relationships it created, whether exploitative or complicated by affection, ensured that intimacy could never be entirely free from questions of power. As Viking society integrated with the broader European world, these dynamics became even more layered, influenced by law, religion, and shifting ideas about kinship. Yet it is precisely in these entanglements that one sees how erotic practices were never simply personal. They were woven into the structures of power, economy, and identity. By the later centuries, when Scandinavia was firmly Christian, many of the older stories of gods and fertility rites were relegated to the status of folklore. Yet in their quiet survival, they remind us of how enduring these practices were. Farmers might still whisper an old verse when planting. A midwife might remember an invocation from her grandmother, and a couple might keep traditions alive in the privacy of their home. The erotic life of the Vikings did not vanish. It simply adapted, carrying forward the mixture of practicality and reverence that had always defined it. And so, when we look back, what we see is not a sensationalized vision of wild Viking indulgence, but something far more grounded and deeply human. Intimacy was tied to survival, to fertility, to humor, and to the bonds that made life endurable through long winters and hard voyages. It was not separate from daily life, but woven directly into it, an inseparable part of eating, working, farming, and storytelling. Perhaps the most telling detail is this. Even in the sagas written long after the Viking Age, erotic practices are never entirely absent. They are there in the jokes, in the marriages negotiated, in the betrayals remembered, and in the subtle ways characters reveal their humanity. This tells us that desire, in all its complexity, was considered worthy of being remembered. And yet, as the old stories faded and new doctrines took hold, one question remains. How much of the Viking understanding of desire, their openness, their connection between intimacy and survival, their ability to treat the erotic as ordinary, has been lost to us today, hidden beneath layers of reinterpretation and myth? Story 2. Marriage and the bonds of property in Viking times. When we think of marriage today, the mind often drifts toward vows, affection, and the idea of romantic partnership. But in the Viking Age, marriage carried a different weight, one that rested not only on intimacy, but on property, kinship, and the obligations of family survival. Desire was present, of course, but it was rarely the leading factor. Instead, marriage stood as a carefully managed contract, balancing the interests of two households. To understand the erotic life of the Vikings, it is necessary to begin with these quiet negotiations, where the boundaries of intimacy were first defined. Marriage was less about two individuals and more about two families entering into alliance. The language of sagas and law codes often frames marriage in terms of land, cattle, and inheritance. A young man seeking a wife did not approach her directly. Instead, he relied on his father or male relatives to speak with her family. The discussions centered on dowries, gifts, and promises of support. In this way, the erotic life of a Viking began within the framework of property exchange, the body of the woman, and at times the standing of the man, became tied to the resources that kept households afloat. This practical nature of marriage does not mean that affection was absent. Many couples likely grew close over years of shared labor, tending the same fields, raising children, and enduring winters together. But when marriages were arranged, they were arranged with survival in mind, not passion. A union meant more hands to work, stronger ties with neighbors, and a chance for both families to secure their lineages. Even the very word used for wife in Old Norse husfrök, mistress of the house, emphasizes the role of managing and sustaining a household rather than embodying romantic ideals. Still, within these formal contracts, intimacy found its way. The night of the wedding was often marked with rituals that blended solemn duty with private expectation. Law texts and poems hint at the ceremonial placement of a bride in her husband's bed, the symbolic transfer of her guardianship, and the public recognition that a new bond had formed. What happened after these rituals was both ordinary and essential, the act of consummation, which legally sealed the union. The community needed to know that the bond was not only spoken but enacted, for without it, inheritance and the transfer of property could be disputed. Interestingly, sagas sometimes record moments when brides resisted or questioned the matches arranged for them. Women in Viking society, while subject to the authority of fathers and husbands, could exert surprising influence. They had the right to divorce under certain conditions. Abandonment, impotence, or mistreatment could all be grounds for dissolving a union. In this way, women were not entirely powerless. The erotic practices of marriage were still framed by obligation, but they contained room for agency, negotiation, and even refusal. The dowry itself carried erotic undertones, though quietly so. It was more than cattle, jewelry, or land. It was a public declaration of the bride's worth and the groom's ability to support her. In giving these gifts, families acknowledged the role of the wife in producing heirs and securing prosperity. Erotic life was intertwined with this expectation, for the continuation of lineage rested on the successful union of bodies. In this sense, every negotiation over property carried within it the unspoken weight of desire, fertility, and the private acts that would determine whether the family line endured. Archaeology offers further glimpses into how marriage bound together property and intimacy. Keys, often placed in the graves of women, symbolize the authority of the wife over the household's stores. A woman did not merely join her husband in name, she became manager of food, goods, and the rhythms of domestic life. In this role, she wielded a form of power, one that directly affected her husband's survival. Intimacy between spouses was, therefore, not only a matter of desire but of cooperation, trust, and the sharing of resources. But what of love? The sagas rarely speak of love in the romantic sense that modern audiences expect. Instead, they emphasize loyalty, obligation, and the weaving of fates. Yet scattered within these texts are hints of deeper attachment. A man mourning his wife's passing, or a woman lamenting the distance of her husband, shows that beyond property and contracts, human feeling was present. These glimpses remind us that beneath the layers of duty, marriages were lived by real people whose experiences of intimacy were not so far removed from our own. In thinking about Viking marriage, it is easy to see only the formal side, the dowries, the negotiations, the legal frameworks. Yet within these structures, intimacy unfolded in countless ways. A shared glance at the hearth, the quiet care of one partner tending the other, or the joint effort of raising children were all part of a lived erotic life. The property exchange set the stage, but the daily acts of living together filled the play. And here, at the heart of Viking marriage, one question lingers. When property and obligation weighed so heavily, how often did intimacy grow into affection, and how often did it remain a quiet duty performed for survival's sake? If you were to walk through a Viking settlement in the 9th or 10th century, you would quickly notice that marriages were not isolated events between two individuals, but threads woven into the wider fabric of kinship and obligation. Unlike modern notions of romance and choice, Viking unions were often strategic moves, calculated with a sober eye toward land, livestock, and alliances. This is not to say that affection never blossomed, but the foundation was unmistakably practical, a ledger of gain and loss drawn across two families. In many cases, the negotiation for marriage resembled the exchange of goods at a marketplace. Families gathered, sometimes over mugs of mead, to haggle over the dowry, which was the contribution a bride's kin brought to the union. These could be bolts of cloth, parcels of land, or even enslaved laborers, depending on the wealth of the household. The groom's family, in turn, offered the bride price, a sum meant not only as compensation, but also as a visible guarantee of commitment. Together, these exchanges formed a system of mutual insurance, ensuring that both parties had something tangible to show for the arrangement, and that obligations would not be lightly dismissed. Interestingly, these contracts were rarely simple handshakes. They were recorded and witnessed, sometimes even recited, before a gathering at the local thing, the Viking assembly, where laws were spoken and disputes settled. Such formality underscores just how much property and social standing were bound into marital arrangements. A poorly handled betrothal could ripple outward, souring alliances and destabilizing community balance. For the Vikings, the household was the engine of survival, and a marriage was the maintenance of that engine, carefully fueled with land, livestock, and kinship promises. One striking detail is how central women were in these transactions, not merely as brides, but as custodians of the dowry. A Viking woman retained control over the goods her family contributed to the marriage, and if the union dissolved, she had the right to reclaim them. This provided a certain security in a society that was otherwise steeped in patriarchal norms. A chest of silver or fertile fields gifted at marriage remained hers, even if her husband chose to part ways. This principle quietly reinforced a woman's standing in the household and community. She was not just a passive figure transferred between families, but a participant whose property rights could tip the scales of negotiation. Daily life within such marriages reflected these arrangements. The household economy was a shared enterprise, but one that always carried the echoes of property contracts. When sheep were slaughtered or barley threshed, the labor connected directly to the wealth apportioned at the marriage. Decisions about storing grain, selling furs, or lending out tools were shaped not only by practical need, but by a lingering awareness of whose property had come into the union and who retained the claim to it. The legal skeleton of marriage loomed even over mundane chores. binding men and women to the careful stewardship of shared and inherited resources. Over time, these arrangements also served to knit entire regions together. A marriage might unite families from different fjords or villages, creating a web of alliances that extended trade routes or secured military support. In this way, marriage was less a private affair and more an act of regional diplomacy. A single match could link grazing rights in one valley with timber rights in another, establishing networks that strengthened survival. Each wedding feast, with its singing and drinking, masked the quieter, longer-term work of extending influence and property claims across the Norse world. But despite the careful orderliness of these contracts, there were still points of tension. What happened if one side failed to uphold their promise of land or livestock? What if a marriage ended prematurely and the question of dowry repayment became contentious? Disputes could turn bitter, dragging families into feuds that might last for generations. The thing often became the arena where such matters were decided, with witnesses called to testify about who had promised what. These disputes remind us that even in a society built on the clarity of spoken contracts, human ambition and disappointment could blur the lines. The balance of affection within these arranged marriages remains a quieter, less documented thread. We can only speculate about how couples carved out companionship in the shadow of property negotiations. Did they find intimacy and partnership amid the legal bindings, or did the weight of obligation keep distance between them? The sagas hint at both possibilities, portraying couples who worked together as equals, and others where tension simmered under the shared roof of the longhouse. When you imagine the crackling hearth at the center of such a household, the smoke curling upward into the rafters, you might picture more than just firewood and warmth. You might see in that rising smoke the merging of two families' fortunes, flickering between cooperation and strain. Yet as much as these arrangements sought to impose order, life has a way of spilling beyond the boundaries of contracts. And so the question lingers. In a world where marriages were built upon property and alliances, how did love or even simple companionship find its way into the spaces between negotiation and necessity? As Viking families lived out the daily consequences of these arranged unions, the household itself became the living symbol of the marriage contract. The longhouse, with its central hearth and wooden beams blackened by smoke, was more than shelter. It was a ledger of sorts, every corner filled with evidence of agreements struck between kin, cattle tethered in the byre, iron tools resting on benches, and woven cloth folded in chests, all carried echoes of dowry exchanges and bride prices. These objects were reminders that behind every steaming pot of stew and every woolen cloak hung to dry was the weight of property ties. For the bride, stepping into this longhouse was not merely a shift in residence, but an assumption of new authority. She often carried a set of keys hung at her belt, which symbolized control over the storerooms. Grain, cheese, ale, and salted fish were locked away under her charge, making her both the guardian of sustenance and the steward of household wealth. In this way, women exercised tangible influence, ensuring that the family's property, including much of what came with them into the marriage, was carefully managed. A man could trade and raid, but without a capable wife managing the stores, his household risked collapse. The rituals surrounding marriage also reveal how seriously these bonds were taken. Feasts stretched on for days, full of laughter and drinking. Yet beneath the merriment was a careful performance of legitimacy. Witnesses observed the exchanges of gifts, and elders reminded the newlyweds of their duties. The shared cup of ale, passed between bride and groom, was more than symbolic. It was a public affirmation that their lives, labor, and property were now intertwined. In a society where words carried the force of law, the spoken vows echoed louder than any feast song, binding two households into one. Still, beneath this order, human unpredictability lingered. Marriages contracted for land and livestock could falter when personalities clashed. A groom who proved feckless or violent, a bride who refused to be sidelined, or a family that reneged on its promises could unravel the careful fabric of alliances. Divorce, surprisingly, was an option available in Viking society, but it was not taken lightly. A woman, if mistreated or neglected, might return to her kin with her dowry intact, leaving the husband to face not only personal shame, but also economic loss. Such outcomes illustrate that while property was central, dignity and fairness carried weight as well. Even sagas and poems, though wrapped in layers of myth and embellishment, reflect these concerns. They tell of households torn apart by disputes over land, and of women who asserted their rights to reclaim dowries when marriages soured. They also speak of families who prospered when unions held strong, their wealth and influence growing across generations. Through these stories, we catch glimpses of how property and affection, law and daily life, wove together in Viking marriages. At the heart of it all lies a paradox. Marriages were designed to be firm and orderly, yet they existed in a world as fluid as the seas the Vikings sailed. Alliances could strengthen trade networks and build legacies, but they could also crumble into quarrels that stained family names for decades. In every chest of silver, in every plot of farmland exchanged at marriage, lay both promise and peril. As the fire dimmed in a Viking longhouse at night, the crackle of embers might have been accompanied by quiet thoughts, not only of tomorrow as tasks of farming or raiding, but also of the precarious balance between love, law, and property. In the hush of that smoky room, one might wonder whether the bonds of marriage brought greater stability, or whether they simply reshuffled the risks that life in the North already carried.